first of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss this wonderful work and chance to read the paper in advance, and I'm glad that I can discuss the presentation and the paper. What I like about this line of work is that the objective to eliminate many parameters and zoom into some of the fundamental factors is really wonderfully done in this work. And I really like how you can then generalize towards the end into many applications where you have a perfect justification why we may have a certain market design or why we have certain mechanisms. And it's quite interesting for me as experimentalist that it is, by the end of the day, a very simple experiments with which we can come up with these conclusions. And then yet have very clear policy implications. Well, the motivation of this work, in particular this review, is that we say the rationality assumption has some flaws. Why does it not work in certain situations? And me, as someone who studies strategy and organization, I'm really interested. I was really, to some degree, actually shocked to not see bound rationality. And I actually looked into the paper. I did a search. Bound rationality is not mentioned. And I think that is really interesting from our perspective. Because whenever we would say, well, the rationality assumption doesn't work, we would jump to bounded rationality and everything that comes along with it. You develop a completely different framework. Well, not completely different. You have references to the adaptive toolbox and other places, but you don't go back to some of the fundamentals in bounded rationality, and yet the theory holds and is very powerful in many circumstances. So for those who study strategy and organization, I think it would be interesting to read up on these mechanisms and how you approach the rationality assumption. At the same time, I'd like to ask you, well, how about time pressure? How about limited information? How about limited cognitive abilities? And how do they play a role in your framework? Well, I do understand that you say, well, I do not want to work with too many parameters, but yet at the same time we have very few, I would think, that would be quite powerful to look at and to consider in this line of work. And then yet, also what Dan said, well, we have many real-world situations where we have these additional parameters that we need to look at. And what I would think that also behavioral economists have looked at so far are two aspects that I would like to stress in this context. And the first is reciprocity. And in most of these experiments, there's no reciprocity. And social interaction by the end of the day means that we have two agents that interact in one way or another. You have it in the stack hunt, obviously, and you have it in the ultimatum game, but it is limited to quite some degree. And the other thing is, and I'm very interested to see Dan also picking up this one. I picked up my preferences. And I think this is punishment, right? Punishment is really a central key in this work. I think towards the end of your slides, most of the implications end up talking about punishment in certain situations, but yet punishment is only in a very limited way represented in the experiment itself. And I would think that mechanisms that we have in some of the more advanced public good games would be quite useful to incorporate in your work. Because after all, when we look at the real world situations that we look at the schools, where we have to apply, or we could apply different type of punishment. When we look at people who don't do the security check with the cars, punishment is on one hand obviously the monetary aspect, but the other one is severe regulatory rules that basically say, well, if you don't check your car, you can't drive anymore, right? And this type of punishment, I think, and that's maybe more generally interesting for us, a really important aspect to look into. Right. Maintaining the rules of play is one of the examples.
You never have to punish anyone. If the probability is high enough, you don't have to punish anyone. This is what happened in our studies.
So finally, well, you argue at the end that because the environment in which the rationality assumption is applied does not creates best payoffs for all agents most of the time. I would argue that we have quite a lot of environments in which when we apply the rationality assumption and the line of work that you would have does actually not create best payoffs for all the agents most of the time, because these additional levels of punishment and these ways to treat and to overcome the market design that was originally designed. So in that sense, I would think that this is a nice start to some extent, but I'm really curious to maybe also discuss over the weekend some of these additional aspects and how they